The night Lord Ashford's solicitor came to the door, Viola Sutton had flour on her hands and a dead man's debts in her pocket. She was 26, a widow of 14 months, and the only thing standing between her younger brother and a workhouse was the small apothecary shop she ran from the ground floor of a rented house on Cutter's Lane. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, gentle-tempered, fond of books, utterly hopeless with money. He had left her nothing but his name and a ledger full of IOUs. She had kept the shop. She had kept Edwin in school. She had learned to make bread from cheaper flour and to smile pleasantly at creditors while calculating, to the penny, exactly how long she could stall them. So when the solicitor knocked, a thin man in an expensive coat, name of Renwick, Viola wiped her hands on her apron and thought, another creditor, another polite demand dressed up in legal language. She was wrong. My client, Renwick said, settling into the only chair she could offer him without shame, is Lord Clifton Ashford, Earl of Dunmore. He has recently become aware that you possess a particular skill. Botanical pharmacology, I believe the term is, and he finds himself in urgent need of your services. Viola looked at him for a moment. He needs a remedy? He needs someone who can identify a poison. The word landed in the warm kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Viola felt the ripple of it move through her chest. His wife, Renwick continued, folding his gloved hands in his lap, Lady Dunmore has been unwell for 6 weeks. The physicians cannot agree on a cause, Lord Ashford believes. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. Lord Ashford believes the illness is not natural. Viola thought of 3 things in rapid succession. The rent she owed on the shop, her brother's school fees due at the end of the month, and the particular expression Thomas had worn in the last weeks of his life. That quiet, frightened look of a man who knows something is wrong but cannot name it. Thomas had died of a fever, a very sudden fever. She asked what Lord Ashford was prepared to pay. The figure Renwick named made the flour on her hands feel suddenly irrelevant. Dunmore Hall was 2 hours north of the city, a stone house of considerable age set back from a long gravel drive lined with lime trees just coming into their autumn colour. Viola arrived on a Tuesday in a hired coach that smelled of damp wool, with her medical case on the seat beside her, and the particular sensation of having made a very large decision very quickly. She had told Edwin she was consulting for a private client. She had told Miss Pratt, who managed the shop on Cutter's Lane, to keep the chamomile syrup off the top shelf, and to charge Mr. Bellamy double because he could afford it and wouldn't notice. She had packed 3 reference texts, her travelling case of dried specimens, and the worn leather journal that had been her father's. Judge Sutton, who had believed that his daughters should understand how the world worked, and had educated them accordingly. Lord Ashford met her in the entrance hall, and Viola's first impression was that he looked like a man who had not slept in 6 weeks, which was, it turned out, precisely the case. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with a kind of face that might have been considered handsome under different circumstances. Good bones, steady eyes, a jaw that suggested he was accustomed to making decisions and living with them. But there were shadows under his eyes deep enough to bruise, and the way he shook her hand, too firm, too careful, the handshake of a man holding himself together by force of will, told her that whatever was happening in this house had stripped away any ease he might once have had. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Thank you for coming, my lord," she said. "Tell me about your wife." Lady Dunmore, Eleanor, she was called, Ellie by those who loved her, was 31 and had been unwell since the 3rd week of August. The symptoms, as Lord Ashford described them, were exactly the kind that slipped through the fingers of an ordinary diagnosis. Fatigue, a persistent tremor in the hands, occasional confusion, episodes of rapid heartbeat that came and went without pattern, a gradual loss of appetite that no one could explain or reverse. 3 physicians had been called. 3 physicians had departed with their fees and their differing opinions. One suspected a disorder of the nerves. One suspected melancholy. The third, an older man named Dr. Waverley, who had attended the family for years, had told Lord Ashford privately that he thought the symptoms were consistent with a slow-acting systemic toxin, but that he could not prove it, and that making such an accusation without proof could ruin the reputation of everyone involved. Lord Ashford had listened to Dr. Waverley, and then he had sent Renwick to find Viola. She examined Lady Dunmore that same afternoon, in a bedroom that smelled of lavender and something underneath the lavender that Viola recognized with a quiet, cold certainty. Something metallic, faint, lingering in the air, and in the residue on the rim of the teacup on the bedside table. Eleanor Ashford was small, fair-haired, and very tired. She smiled when Viola introduced herself, a real smile rather than a polite one, and said, "Clifton says you know plants the way some people know languages." Her voice was thin, the tremor visible even in the slight movement of her hands on the coverlet. "I learned from my father," Viola said, sitting beside her. "He believed useful knowledge ought to be shared regardless of who needs it." "I like him already," Lady Dunmore said. And then, more quietly, "Do you think something is wrong with me, beyond what the doctors have said?" Viola met her eyes. She had her father's instinct for directness, sharpened by 18 months of running a business alone, and a lifetime of being underestimated by people who thought a woman in an apron couldn't follow a logical argument. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to test a few things before I say anything certain. Will you tell me who prepares your meals, your teas?" Something moved behind Eleanor's eyes, not surprise, more like the look of a woman who has been waiting for someone to ask the right question. "Dorinda," she said, "my sister-in-law. She has been very attentive since the wedding." Viola did not go to Lord Ashford that evening with accusations. She went with questions. They sat in the library, which was warmer than the drawing-room, and had, she noticed, the particular quality of a room where one man had spent many recent solitary hours. And she asked him to tell her about his sister. Dorinda Ashford was 3 years his junior, unmarried, and had lived at Dunmore Hall her entire life. She had, by all accounts, been the mistress of the house in every practical sense since their mother's death 8 years ago. She had managed the servants, managed the household accounts, managed the social calendar, managed everything with the kind of efficiency that was, as Lord Ashford described it with a complicated expression on his face, both admirable and absolute. And then, 14 months ago, he had married Eleanor. "They don't get on?" Viola asked. "Dorinda is." He stopped. Started again. "Dorinda has always been very capable. This is her home. I understand that Eleanor's arrival changed a great deal for her. That is a very charitable way of describing it," Viola said. He looked at her sharply, and for a moment she thought she had overstepped. She was, after all, a solicitor's client, a paid consultant, a woman who had arrived that morning in a hired coach and currently smelled of dried herbs. But what she saw in his expression wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who has said the careful thing for so long that hearing someone say the plain thing comes as a relief. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." Viola spent the next 3 days in a state of careful observation, moving through Dunmore Hall with her leather journal and the patient, unhurried manner she had learned from years of identifying things that looked like one thing and turned out to be another. She examined the kitchen garden, cataloguing what was grown there. She spent an afternoon in the still room, which Dorinda maintained with impressive precision. Rows of labelled jars, neat bundles of dried herbs, a small copper still that smelled of rosehip, and something she couldn't immediately place. She requested access to the household accounts under the pretext of understanding the procurement of medicinal herbs, and found, on 3 separate occasions over the past 6 weeks, a purchase of foxglove from an apothecary in the neighbouring town that could not be accounted for by anything in the still-room's current inventory. She was careful. She was thorough. She did not rush because she knew, from her father, from her years behind the shop counter, from the particular education of being a woman who had to be twice as certain before she spoke, that a wrong accusation was as dangerous as no accusation at all. And she watched Dorinda. Dorinda Ashford was 44 years old, impeccably dressed, and possessed of the kind of social grace that could skin you alive while making you feel you'd been complimented. She was unfailingly polite to Viola, which is to say she treated her with the specific calibrated courtesy one extends to a person whose presence one finds offensive, but whose usefulness one cannot deny. She called her Mrs. Sutton with a slight emphasis on the Mrs. that managed to imply a great deal about what she thought of women who worked for their living. Viola, who had been called worse things by better people, smiled pleasantly and took notes. On the 4th morning, Dorinda brought Eleanor her morning tea herself. This was not unusual. She had done so, Viola learned, almost every day since Eleanor's illness began. A gesture of sisterly care, she had told anyone who asked. A way of being useful. Viola watched from the doorway of the adjoining room, which she had positioned herself in by the simple method of arriving there first and staying very still. She watched Dorinda set the tray on the bedside table. She watched Dorinda pour the tea. She watched Dorinda add, from a small glass bottle that she withdrew from her pocket and replaced there in one practiced motion, 4 drops of something clear and odourless into the cup. She kept her face very still. She waited until Dorinda had left the room. Then she crossed to the bedside, picked up the cup before Eleanor could reach for it, and said, in the most ordinary voice she could manage, "I wonder if I might test this, my lady. For the herb content, it's part of my assessment." Eleanor looked at her. Then she looked at the door through which her sister-in-law had just departed. Then she looked back at Viola. "All right," she said, very quietly. The analysis took the better part of a day. Viola worked in the stillroom, which was ironic in a way she did not allow herself to find funny, using the equipment that was already there alongside the contents of her own case. She identified digitalis, foxglove, in a concentration precise enough to cause all of Eleanor's symptoms, the heart irregularities, the tremor, the fatigue, the confusion, enough to sicken, not enough to kill quickly, enough to do its work slowly, over weeks, in quantities that were difficult to detect and easy to dismiss. The dosage was, in its way, a kind of expertise. Someone had been careful, someone had done their research. She found Lord Ashford in the stables at dusk, which was where Renwick had told her. He sometimes went when the house became too much for him. He was not riding. He was standing with his hand on the neck of a grey horse, and looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who has been holding a terrible thought at a distance for a long time, and is very tired from the effort. "My lord," she said. He turned. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him go very still. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She used plain language and precise terms, because she had learned that the shock of a clear truth was usually easier to bear than the prolonged agony of a decorated one. She told him what she had found in the tea. She told him what she had seen Dorinda do. She told him what the foxglove would have continued to do, administered in those quantities over several more weeks. He stood very still throughout. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and she could see the thing happening behind his eyes. The rearrangement of everything he had believed about his sister, about his household, about the 6 weeks in which he had watched his wife grow thinner and more tired, while a physician told him it was probably her nerves. "She knew," he said finally, "that if Eleanor died, she would be needed again," Viola said. "She would be indispensable. The house would require her." He put his hand back on the horse's neck. The horse stood patiently. "I kept telling myself I was imagining it," he said. "The way Dorinda looks at her. I told myself it was just the adjustment, that it would improve, that Dorinda would come to." He stopped. "I should have done something sooner." "You sent for me," Viola said. "That was something." He looked at her then, a real look rather than the careful, composed glances he had been managing for 3 days. And she saw in it something she recognized, not because it was like Thomas, who had been gentle and vague and fundamentally uncertain, but because it was like her father, who had always known when he was wrong, and been the kind of man who said so out loud. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I did." What happened after that took several days to resolve, and was considerably less tidy than the discovery itself. Lord Ashford dismissed Dorinda the day following, in a private meeting that Viola was not present for, and did not ask about, what she learned from the household staff, who, now that the particular tension of the past 6 weeks was beginning to dissipate, proved to be a remarkably well-informed group of people, was that the meeting had been brief, that Lord Ashford had said very little, and that Dorinda had left the following morning without speaking to anyone. Lady Dunmore began to recover within days of the tea being stopped. It was not a dramatic recovery. The body does not work like a story, with sudden reversals and clear turning points. It was gradual, incremental, like the return of light after a long winter, a little more colour in her face each morning, the tremor in her hands lessening, her appetite returning in small degrees. She asked Viola, on the 5th day, to teach her the names of the plants in the kitchen garden. "In case," Eleanor said with a steadiness that Viola recognized as a particular kind of courage, "I ever need to know," Viola taught her. They spent an afternoon walking the rows of the garden in the thin October sun, and Viola said the names. Their common names and their Latin names, their properties and their dangers, and Eleanor listened with the focused attention of someone who understands that knowledge is not just interesting but useful, and sometimes necessary. Lord Ashford found them there as the light was failing. He stood at the edge of the garden path and watched his wife learning the names of foxglove and hemlock and meadow saffron from a woman who smelled of dried herbs and kept a shop on Cutter's Lane, and his face was the face of a man in whom some long-held tension had finally, quietly, begun to release. He did not interrupt. He waited until Viola finished a sentence, and then he said her name, Mrs. Sutton, and when she turned he said, "I wonder if you might stay another week. Dr. Waverley will want a full written account of your findings, and I should like—" He paused. "I should like Eleanor to have someone to consult with. Who knows what to look for?" Viola thought about the rent on the shop. She thought about Edwin's school fees. She thought about Mrs. Pratt, who was perfectly capable and had been running the shop alone for 4 days already without setting anything on fire. "Another week," she said. He nodded, looked at his wife, who was holding a sprig of something and asking Viola what it was called, looked back at Viola. "Thank you," he said, "for not waiting until you were certain beyond any shadow of doubt to speak. Some people would have. My father was a judge," Viola said. "He spent 30 years waiting for certainty and watching it arrive too late. I decided early that preponderance of evidence was good enough to act on." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. He was not, she suspected, a man who came easily to smiling just now, but something adjacent to it, something that had the quality of a door, slightly open. "He sounds like a sensible man," Lord Ashford said. "He was," Viola said. "He would have liked you." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out in the way that honest things sometimes do, when you've been holding them back and then stop paying attention for a moment. She felt the heat of it in her face and looked back at Eleanor, who was turning the sprig of something in her fingers and very carefully not looking at either of them. "I mean," Viola said in her most professional voice, "that he valued people who took evidence seriously. It was a professional respect." "Of course," Lord Ashford said. He was looking at the garden. She stayed the extra week, and then, because Dr. Waverley's written account required clarification, and because Lady Dunmore's recovery was steady but would benefit from continued monitoring, she stayed a week beyond that. Edwin came to visit on the second Saturday, taking the morning coach up from the city, with his coat buttoned wrong and his hair insufficiently combed, and spent an afternoon in the Dunmore Hall library with the particular expression of a boy who has wandered into paradise by accident. Lord Ashford found him there mid-afternoon, standing in front of a wall of legal texts with his neck craned sideways to read the titles, and instead of removing him, sat down and asked him what he was interested in. Edwin, who was 16 and not particularly accustomed to Earls taking an interest in his opinions, told him about his ambition to read law. Lord Ashford asked several specific and intelligent questions. When Viola collected Edwin at 4 o'clock to put him back on the evening coach, he was flushed with enthusiasm and carrying a book Lord Ashford had pressed on him, a collection of case studies in common law, which he clutched the entire journey home. "He's very decent," Edwin told Viola, with the particular tone of someone revising a prior assumption. For an Earl. Viola, who was looking out the coach window at the lime trees along the drive, said, "Yes, I suppose he is." She was preparing to leave on the third Friday, packing her reference texts into her case, checking the stoppers on her specimen jars. When Eleanor came to find her, Lady Dunmore was looking well. There was colour in her face and steadiness in her hands, and the particular quality of a woman who has survived something and knows it, and has decided that knowing it is a form of strength rather than a wound. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched Viola pack and said, in the comfortable manner of someone who has decided that formality is wasted on a person she considers a friend, "He'll be in the library, if you want to say goodbye." Viola considered the jar of dried meadowsweet she was holding. "I thought I'd leave him a note, Viola," Eleanor said, and then when Viola looked up, "He is not good at the first word. He never has been. He'll stand in a room and think a very great deal, and then say something practical and useful and not at all what he means. If you leave a note, he'll write back something polite and correct, and you'll both spend a great deal of unnecessary time not saying things. Viola looked at her. Eleanor looked back with the serenity of a woman who has spent 14 months learning to read her husband very well, and is now, it seemed, extending that knowledge as a gift. He asked Dr. Waverley, Eleanor said carefully, whether there was any professional reason why a botanical consultant might need to maintain an ongoing relationship with a household that had recently experienced a poisoning incident. Viola was quiet for a moment. What did Dr. Waverley say? He said it was an extremely prudent precaution. Viola set the jar of meadowsweet carefully into the case, closed the clasp, picked up the case, and then, because she was her father's daughter and believed in acting on preponderance of evidence rather than waiting for certainty to arrive too late, she went to find the library. Lord Ashford was there, as Eleanor had said he would be. He was standing at the window with a book he wasn't reading, and when she came in, he looked up with the expression of a man who had been thinking something and had not yet decided what to do about it. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, "I thought you were leaving this afternoon." "I came to say goodbye," Viola said. "Properly." He set the book on the windowsill. The afternoon light came in at a low angle, the particular golden light of late October, and the room smelled of leather and paper, and the faint herbal quality that had she suspected followed her into every room she'd entered for the past 3 weeks. "I've been thinking," he said, "about Dr. Waverley's suggestion, regarding an ongoing consultancy." "So has Eleanor," Viola said. A pause, and, "I think," Viola said, "that preponderance of evidence suggests it's a sensible arrangement." Something shifted in his expression. The door quality was there again, slightly more open than before. His hands, she noticed, had unclenched. "Your father," he said, "was indeed a very sensible man." Outside the library windows, the lime trees along the drive were losing their leaves in the October wind, each one falling with the particular unhurried certainty of something that had been ready for a while and was only waiting for the right moment to let go.